So I talked about the Alexandrian heresy in the last video. Let's talk about Babylon and Persia. Babylon and Persia, that story, and the background information, what is missing from the Bible there that helps you understand this early Jesus movement. There's a lot, so buckle up. I've always been more focused on kind of how things were developing in the West, just like a lot of Western Christians growing up, and that was definitely where the focus was. But if we talk about the Great Commission and this idea of spreading this new Jesus message, the Jesus movement, it didn't just go south, it didn't just go north and west, it also went east. So why is the Eastern movement so important? So just like when I talked about Alexandria and Alexander and this whole 300 plus years of information in the intertestamental period that we don't have in the Bible, all the teaching that develops, all the development of the faith in that area. I hate to say it, but there's just as much or more happening in the East, in the areas that Greece and Rome were not able to hold on to as a part of the empire. Like Beth mentioned, the Judea is right on the edge, so when you start to look east, what do you see? At the time of Jesus, you see Parthia, Persia, this area that is full of people. You really don't know anything about what happens in that area after the end of the Old Testament. The Old Testament just basically says the Jewish people come back from that area and reestablish the temple and resettle and recenter the Jewish faith back in Jerusalem. But that wasn't just everybody coming back to Jerusalem. Most of the tribes of Jacob that were left in Jerusalem at the time of this Babylonian conquering and this exile of the Jewish people, it was about 25% of the Judean people that were exiled into Babylon. And then there's 70 years or so before the Persians conquer Babylon and the Jews return. That return is laid out in Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And there's some additional prophecy that you get in the Old Testament around that time. But only about a third of the Jews that were in Babylon left Babylon and went back. About 2/3 stayed behind. Persians were not there to destroy all the Judeans that were in Babylon. They were happy to let the leadership and the priesthood that wanted to go back and establish their faith at the temple back in their Holy Land. They were very supportive of that idea. But 2/3 of the people who lived in Babylon that were of that faith and of that people group decided not to go back. They decided to stay. So over the next 400 years of development between the Old and the New Testament, a lot of the development of the Jewish faith, what was happening in Jerusalem with the leaders in Jerusalem, but a lot of the scholarship was happening still back in Babylon. There were other religious groups, obviously, in Babylon beside the Jews. The Jews were a minority. But just like the influences of the Greeks in the West that was spilling over into Jerusalem, and many of the Jewish people going into these Greek areas and mixing their ideologies and their faiths and philosophy and history with the Greek people in the West. And, I highlighted how that happened in Alexandria. That was still happening back in the East, in the Persian Empire. So during this time, you start to see the development of Jewish scripture that is not included in the Old Testament. That scripture continued to develop centuries and centuries before Jesus, and then centuries and centuries after Jesus. And what that has developed into is the Babylonian Talmud. That is a huge collection of scripture writings, interpretations. It's broken down in many, many different ways, with many, many different titles, but a lot of that is what is Judaism today. Christians don't really look at the development of the Talmud before the time of Jesus or after the time of Jesus to really figure out where Jesus fits in the story of Judaism. Jesus didn't fit in the story of Judaism in the Old Testament. He fits into the story of Judaism in the 1st century AD, after hundreds of years of this development of the Talmud. And then, the Christian church, the early church, is a Jewish development of their faith, just like all of these other developments that were continuing to happen in Babylonia. So, if you look at the Talmud and you translate it into English, I had to look this up. The Talmud translated into English, the Babylonian Talmud. There's a whole separate Talmud that is also the Jerusalem Talmud, which I'll leave for another time. It's very different. It treats Jesus very different. But the Babylonian Talmud explains the story of Jesus from the perspective of the Jewish people over the next few centuries. That Talmud contains roughly about 10 million words. The entire Old Testament and New Testament combined is a little over 600,000 words. You back out the New Testament and I don't know, it's less than 500,000 words are the Old Testament. So the Talmud is 20 times the size of the full collection of the Old Testament Torah, of the Old Testament histories of the Jewish people, the Old Testament prophecies of the Jewish people. So Christians view all of the Talmud as heretical. It's not a part of their faith. Not saying it needs to be, but understanding Christianity's relationship to Judaism, it really helps to understand more of what Judaism is. And there's about 20 times as much information in the Talmud as there is in the Old Testament. So Christians spend a lot of time on the Old Testament, and understandably so, and trying to understand the history of the Israelite people and the Messiah that came from those people. But the greatest biblical scholars who commit their lives to understanding the Old Testament, or one book of the Old Testament, they're looking at a tiny, tiny fraction of Judaism and the faith of the Jewish people. Getting to this direct issue of heresy when it comes to this new Jewish sect and the early Christian church. The message of Jesus, as you would expect, as a part of the Great Commission, was going to go to the people of their faith who lived in Babylon and Persia. There were a lot of people of Israel that lived in that area and had lived in that area since some of those people came back to Jerusalem in like 400, 450, 500 BC. So the ministry of Jesus in the story of Jesus, if it was going to go to all of the people of the world, and especially the people of the faith, that was the primary focus of this Messiah, there was going to be a lot of discussion about Jesus happening in the East. So who went east? I think the most famous of the early disciples, one of the 12, and some of the other of the 70 early apostles that are talked about in the book of Acts. Some of that group of 70 and one key disciple really drove the message into Babylon and Persia, and that was Thomas. Thomas had plenty of help. It wasn't just him. I believe Adai is the name of one of the 70 that becomes sort of the church father in Edessa, which is like right on the border of Turkey and the Holy Land. But it's, when you think of this fertile crescent, this route from Jerusalem and Israel up and around over into Babylon, or what's Iraq, this is sort of on the northern road on the way over. So it sort of became the gateway of the church to the Eastern Jewish and non-Jewish people of the East. This is where the church sort of came from and was sort of home base for this Eastern mission. I mentioned Judaism was a minority. The majority religion in that area was something called Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster was this figure from the history of those people. Did not do the same things as Moses, but would have been looked at the same way as Jewish people and the other tribes of Israel, how they looked at Moses. That was how the people in the East looked at Zoroaster. It was, this great prophet, deliverer of the law, all of those things. And it was sort of the foundational person in Scripture. Moses plays a bigger role in Scripture than Abraham does. Zoroaster is not God. He doesn't claim to be God. He's a prophet, and he's a deliverer of law in a very similar way to Moses. And the beliefs of Zoroastrianism become a part of the beliefs of Judaism through this close interrelationship between the people of Israel in the Babylonian captivity. The return of those people from the Babylonian captivity, but not all of those people. The ones who stayed behind, that became the authors and philosophers and prophets, were greatly influenced by the majority religion in their homeland of Persia and Babylon. So when the message of Jesus finally is going into that area, it's being delivered by devout Jesus believers. Many of them, most of them were Jewish. They had their foundational beliefs in God from Judaism, and they had this messianic message from Judaism that they were spreading to these other Jewish areas and to the believers in Zoroastrianism. So if you were to tell the message of Jesus to somebody who was Zoroastrian, it was very different than trying to tell the message of Jesus to somebody who was Greek or Roman. So the words that are used, the imagery that is used, the description of good and evil, where baptism fits into things, The Zoroastrians were deeply religious people, very devoted people, and they have strict rules around ritual, around water and fire, and how water is used in ritual compared to how fire is used in ritual. And a lot of the imagery that we end up getting in Christianity related to good and evil, God being the good guy, Satan being the bad guy, that's very Zoroastrian. It's even more Zoroastrian than the battles of the light and the dark in the Old Testament, in the Torah. The battle between the light and the dark at times in the Old Testament. It's a little confusing, when you look at like the book of Job and this idea of an accuser, and you look at Sodom and Gomorrah and this negotiation between God and this dark force who is telling God that these are lost people and it's hopeless and we should just destroy them all. The good and evil in ancient Judaism is a lot of times a partnership, even though there's conflicting opinions. It does look like a cooperative action is happening a lot of times. In Zoroastrianism, there's way less partnership. It's a very dualistic way of thinking. There's light, there is dark, and these two forces are constantly at war, not working together to mold and judge the people. So a lot of these Christian ideas that are very familiar today came out of this Eastern mission and the adoption of some of these dualistic ideas of the Eastern early believers. There's also a much greater mystical focus in the East than there is in Judaism in the first century around Jerusalem. It was very ritualistic and law-based. It was very, very material. The Eastern views of God and the darkness were way more spiritual and etheric and, underlying actions of mankind. These dark and light forces driving behavior inside of us and creating the chaos of the world. It was very Zoroastrian. So when you see writings, heretical writings specifically, that come out of the Eastern Church, they sound different, they look different, they feel different, but they include the teachings of Jesus as you would explain them to somebody with that background in right and wrong, understanding of God, understanding of God's adversary. You're just going to have different language, different vocabulary that you would use to explain the teachings of Jesus to people with those backgrounds. So out of that Eastern mission, we get a lot of great scripture that does not make it into the final cut of the New Testament. Again, not because it is wrong, but because it describes Jesus in a very different way than a Second Temple Pharisee would describe Jesus. Completely different understanding of God, the development of that understanding over centuries, how that understanding was intermixed with other religions as it developed. Very different story in Alexandria versus Jerusalem versus Tarsus versus Babylon and Persia. So, good place to start looking at the slightly different imagery of the story of Jesus to a different people group outside of Asia Minor and Rome, where the mission of Paul happens. If you want to look at the other missions of Jesus, the mission of Thomas to the east, and the Gospel of Thomas that develops as a part of that, doesn't necessarily mean Thomas sat down and wrote the gospel. But the gospel of Thomas was developed out of the Church of Thomas and the mission of Thomas. That was a very important mission to the early church. So probably talk a lot more about Thomas, but if Thomas does anything of value for the early church, the Gospel of Thomas makes it clear that God is not a man on a throne or an absentee landlord, somebody who, makes a bunch of rules, and then if you don't follow those rules, you are punished, and if you do a good job with the rules, maybe you'll have a peaceful afterlife. God in the Gospel of Thomas is very real, very active, very involved, and that would have fit well, with the beliefs in the background of those Zoroastrians and Eastern Jews who had adopted many of this understanding of good and evil from the neighbors and friends and colleagues and leaders and fellow students, fellow believers. It was an important development of both Judaism and Christianity that came from that church. So learning a little bit more about that, I think, is a good idea. So yeah, Gospel of Thomas is a good place to start. Sure, we'll talk more about it.